Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We may extend the question period a little bit longer because there was a slight delay in getting the report up to the website. We are here today because of a terrible tragedy was allowed to occur over many years at Penn State University, one in which many children were repeatedly victimized and gravely harmed. Our hearts and prayers are with the many children, now young men, who were the victims of a now convicted serial pedophile. I'd like to remind you all and those watching this conference today of the need to report child abuse to the authorities. In Pennsylvania, you can report that child sexual abuse to the Department of Public Welfare's Child Line. That number, which will be up here during the conference, is 800-932-0313. It is our sincere hope that this report and the subsequent actions by Penn State will help to bring every victim some relief and support. Penn State University is an outstanding educational institution which is rightly proud of its students, alumni, faculty, and staff, who in turn hold that institution in very high esteem. We fully appreciate the strong emotions which surround these tragic events in our work. All of us here today understand that it is the duty of adults to protect children and to immediately report any suspected child sex abuse to law enforcement authorities. Our team was reminded of this on a daily basis because Henderson South, which was our base on the Penn State campus, was the former child care center, with some of the children's artwork still there. On November 21st, the Special Investigations Task Force, established by the Board of Trustees, retained us to conduct a full, fair, and completely independent investigation. I commend Ken Fraser, chairman of the task force, and Ron Tamales, the vice chairman of the task force, and other colleagues and their colleagues for the steps they took to ensure the independence and thoroughness of our investigation. To conduct this investigation, we assembled an outstanding team of former law enforcement, lawyers, one of whom is a former Navy SEAL, and officials, including former prosecutors, FBI agents, Pennsylvania and Delaware state police officers, with many decades of experience in conducting sensitive investigations, especially crimes against children. I am pleased to be joined this morning by many of my team members. Our team conducted over 430 interviews of various individuals. I did the first one myself the day before Thanksgiving and the last one on Friday. The evidence found by our investigators included critical, contemporaneous correspondence from the times of these events. Our investigative team made independent discovery of the critical 1998 and 2001 emails, the most important evidence in the case. We also confirmed through our separate forensic review that the correct year of the Sandusky sexual assault witnessed by Michael McQuarrie was 2001 and not 2002, as set forth in the original grand jury presentment. We adhered faithfully to our original mandate to investigate this matter fully, fairly, and completely, without fear or favor. We have shown no favoritism towards any of the parties, including the Board of Trustees, our client. At all times, our demand for total independence was respected. We took the unusual step of not providing any draft of this report to the Board of Trustees or to the task force prior to the posting this morning. They are seeing it today for the first time, as all of you are. In our investigation, we sought to clarify what happened, including who knew what, and when events happened, and to examine the university's policies, procedures, compliance, and internal controls relating to identifying and reporting sexual abuse of children. Specifically, we work to identify any failures or gaps in the university's control environment, compliance programs, and culture which may have enabled these crimes against children to occur on the Penn State campus and go undetected and unreported for at least 14 years. As you will read in our report, Penn State failed to implement the provisions of the Clery Act, a 1990 federal statute that requires the collecting and reporting of crimes such as Sandusky committed on campus in 2001. Indeed, on the day Sandusky was arrested, Penn State's Clery Act implementation plan was still in a draft form. Mr. Spanier said that he and the board never even had a discussion about the Clery Act until November 2011. Our work was done in parallel with several other investigations by agencies and government authorities, including the Pennsylvania State Attorney General, Pennsylvania State Police, the United States Attorney, Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the U.S. Department of Education. We continuously interfaced and cooperated with those agencies and authorities. We also received assistance from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. As promised, we immediately turned over any relevant evidence we found to these authorities, such as the critical February 27, 2001 emails between Mr. Spanier, Schultz, and Curley. The complete emails are now available on our website. Unfortunately, portions of these emails have been leaked to the media. We strongly condemn and deplore these leaks. Let me assure you that none of these leaks came from the Special Investigative Counsel team. Some individuals declined to be interviewed. Also, the Pennsylvania Attorney General requested that we not interview certain potential witnesses. We honored those requests. Mr. Paterno passed away before he had the opportunity to speak with us, although we did speak with some of his representatives. We believe that he was willing to speak with us and would have done so but for his serious deteriorating health. We were able to review and evaluate his grand jury testimony, his public statements, and notes and papers from his files that were provided to us by his attorney. Our most saddening and sobering finding is the total disregard for the safety and welfare of Sandusky's child victims by the most senior leaders at Penn State. The most powerful men at Penn State failed to take any steps for 14 years to protect the children who Sandusky victimized. Mr. Spanier, Schultz, Paterno, and Curley never demonstrated, through actions or words, any concern for the safety and well-being of Sandusky's victims until after Sandusky's arrest. In critical written correspondence that we uncovered on March 20th of this year, we see evidence of their proposed plan of action in February 2001 that included reporting allegations about Sandusky to the authorities. After Mr. Curley consulted with Mr. Paterno, however, they changed the plan and decided not to make the report to the authorities. The failure to protect the February 9, 2001 child victim or make attempts to identify him created a dangerous situation for other unknown, unsuspecting young boys who were lured to the Penn State campus and football games by Sandusky and victimized repeatedly by him. Further, they exposed this child to additional harm by alerting Sandusky, who was the only one who knew the child's identity, about what McQuarrie saw in the shower on the night of February 9, 2001. The stated reasons by Mr. Spanier, Schultz, Paterno, and Curley for not taking action to identify the victim and for not reporting Sandusky to the police or child welfare are: 1, Nobody told him it was sexual conduct. 2, Sandusky should be treated humanely. And 3, somebody else would handle it. Taking into account the available witness statements and evidence, it is more reasonable to conclude that in order to avoid the consequences of bad publicity, the most powerful leaders at Penn State University, Mr. Spanier, Schultz, Paterno, and Curley, repeatedly concealed facts relating to Sandusky's child abuse from the authorities, the Board of Trustees, the Penn State community, and the public at large. Although concern to treat the child abuser humanely was expressly stated, no such sentiments were ever expressed by them to Sandusky's victims. The evidence shows that these 4 men also knew about a 1998 criminal investigation of Sandusky related to suspected sexual misconduct and a young boy in a Penn State football locker shower room. Again, they showed no concern about the victim. The evidence shows that Mr. Paterno was made aware of the 1998 investigation of Sandusky, followed it closely, but failed to take any action, even though Sandusky had been a key member of his coaching staff for about 30 years and had an office just steps away from Mr. Paterno. At the very least, Mr. Paterno could have alerted the entire football staff in order to prevent Sandusky from bringing another child into the Lash building. Mr. Spanier, Schultz, Paterno, and Curley also failed to alert the Board of Trustees about the 1998 investigation or take any other action against Mr. Sandusky. None of them ever spoke to Sandusky about his conduct. In short, nothing was done, and Sandusky was allowed to continue with impunity. Based on the evidence, the only known intervening factor between the decision made on February 25, 2001 by Mr. Spanier, Curley, and Schultz to report the incident to the Department of Public Welfare and then agreeing not to do so on February 27th was Mr. Paterno's February 26th conversation with Mr. Curley regarding what to do about Sandusky. We never had the opportunity to talk with Mr. Paterno, but he did say what he told McQuarrie on February 10, 2011, when McQuarrie reported what he saw Sandusky doing in the shower the night before. Quote, "You did what you had to do. It is now my job to figure out what we want to do." What was to figure out here? We also know that he delayed, Mr. Paterno, reporting Sandusky's sexual conduct because Mr. Paterno did not want to, quote, interfere with people's weekend. To his credit, Mr. Paterno stated on November 9, 2011, with the benefit of hindsight, "I wish I had done more." Their callous and shocking disregard for child victims was underscored by the grand jury, which noted in its November 4, 2011 presentment that there was, quote, "no attempt to investigate, to identify victim 2, or to protect that child or others from similar conduct, except as related to preventing its recurrence on university property," close quote. None of these 4 men took any responsible action after February 2001, other than Mr. Curley informing the Second Mile that Mr. Sandusky had showered with a boy. Even though they all knew about the 1998 incident, the best they could muster to protect Sandusky's victims was to ask Sandusky not to bring his, quote, guests, unquote, into the Penn State facilities. We found no evidence that the Penn State Board of Trustees was aware of the allegations regarding Sandusky in 1998 and 2001, but that does not shield the board from criticism. Despite its duties of care and oversight of the university and its officers, the board failed to create an environment which held the university's most senior officers accountable to it. Mr. Spanier resisted the board's attempt to have more transparency. In fact, around the time that Mr. Sandusky, Mr. Curley, and Mr. Schultz were arrested, Mr. Spanier was unwilling to give the board any more information than what was going to be told by him to the public. After a media report on March 31st, 2011, the board was put on notice about serious allegations that Sandusky was sexually assaulting children on the Penn State campus. Yet, it failed in its duty to make reasonable inquiry into these serious matters and to demand any action by the president. The president, a senior vice president, and general counsel did not perform their duty to make timely, thorough, and forthright reports of the 1998 and 2001 allegations to the board. This was a failure of governance for which the board must also bear responsibility. From 1998 to 2011, Penn State's tone at the top for transparency, compliance, police reporting, and child protection was completely wrong, as shown by the inaction and concealment on the part of its most senior leaders, and followed by those at the bottom of the university's pyramid of power. This is best reflected by the janitor's decision not to report Sandusky's horrific 2000 sexual assault of a young boy in the Lash Building shower. These janitors were afraid of being fired for reporting a powerful football coach. The other important part of our charge was to make recommendations to prevent such catastrophic failures to report from ever again occurring at Penn State. The Board of Trustees had requested recommendations as soon as possible in order to improve policies and procedures regarding the protection of children on its campuses. Just this summer alone, over 20,000 non-student minors are participating in sport campuses just at the University Park campus. To ensure that these children would be better protected, we gave the Board of Trustees 14 of our preliminary recommendations in January, almost all of which have now been implemented. Further, we suggested that some longer-term changes, including the creation of a comprehensive and stringent compliance program, including board oversight through a compliance committee. That committee would have oversight responsibility for all regulatory obligations, including the Clery Act, and the chief compliance officer would have a direct reporting line to the committee. The university has commenced a national search for a highly qualified chief compliance officer and adopted 2 new policies for the protection of children. One provides for annual training on child abuse and mandatory reporting for all employees. The other revises and strengthens the university's background check process. In addition to our interim recommendations, we have added 119 recommendations set forth in today's report. One of the most important of our recommendations is for Penn State to study itself, evaluate, and make any other additional needed changes. The goal should be to create a more open and compliant culture which protects children and not adults who abuse them. The release of our report today marks the beginning of a process for Penn State and not the end. It is critical that Old Main, the board, and the Penn State community never forget these failures and commit themselves to strengthening an open, compliant, and victim-sensitive environment where everyone has the duty to blow the whistle on anyone who breaks this trust, no matter how powerful or prominent they may appear to be. We'll take some questions now at this point.
Can you elaborate on that critical conversation between Tim
I can't. As you know, we didn't have the opportunity to interview either of them. We are basing this reasonable conclusion on the emails, the circumstantial evidence, but we do not know what the content of that conversation was. Yes, sir.
Chris Gordon, NBC Washington News 4. Following up on that conversation, could it be construed as obstruction of justice, conspiracy, aiding or abetting, or cover-up?
Yep. Those are all legal conclusions which I'm not prepared to make. The evidence clearly shows, in our view, an active agreement to conceal, and I think it would be up to a grand jury and a law enforcement officer to make decisions whether it meets the elements of criminal offenses. Yes, ma'am.
Judge Freeh, Susan Candiotti from CNN. Did you say that you could find no linkage at all between Mr. Sandusky's retirement in 1999 after the 1998 incident?
Yes, we reviewed very, very carefully the circumstances and contents of Mr. Sandusky's retirement in 1999. He was paid a very large, unprecedented sum of money, $168,000. He was given not just emeritus status, but extraordinary access to the key and most sensitive parts of the university's football building and program. However, there is no evidence that we found that would indicate that that retirement and all the elements that went into it were related in any way to removing him from the university, silencing him, making him happy, whatever you want to describe. I have no evidence to believe that.
Judge Freeh, Jim Otto from ABC News. Just recently, the family of Joe Paterno released a statement in which he said, before he died, that this was not a football problem, so this should not be linked to the football program. Do you agree with that statement? Was this a football problem?
The rapes of these boys occurred in the Lash building. Mr. Paterno had his office in the Lash building, steps away from Mr. Sandusky. Mr. Sandusky was one of his chief defense coaches. Again, we don't have the benefit of having spoken to Mr. Paterno, as I believe he intended to do. However, we have a statement that he made with respect to the conversation when McQuaid first advised him of what he had seen in the shower the night of February 9th, Friday night. And Mr. Paterno's quote was, "You did what you had to do. Now it's up to me to decide what we want to do." I think that's a very telling and a very important and critical statement made, again, not on a hearsay basis by Mr. Paterno himself. Yes, sir.
Bruce Gordon of Fox 29 in Philadelphia. Can you address just a little bit the degree to which Penn State's handling or mishandling of of all of these incidents led to further abuse and put other kids at risk?
Well, I think you'll see from our report and even my remarks this morning, the board failed in its oversight of the senior officers of the university. They did not create an atmosphere where the president and the senior officers felt they were accountable to the board. In any corporate structure, private or public, the function of a board is to create an atmosphere of accountability where the officers who manage the day-to-day operation of the enterprise feel obligated to advise the board as to serious matters on a timely and fulsome basis. That clearly did not happen here beginning in 1998. It graphically did not happen after the March 31st, 2011 article in the Patriot News. It continued up to the point where Mr. Sandusky was arrested. Most incredibly, most of the board members did not know about the arrest until they read it in the newspapers. So that would be, in my view, a failure of governance, a failure of oversight, and that has got to be a contributing cause to the continuing activities that have been so tragically reported here. Yes, sir.
Judge Freeh, Dave Marcheski with ABC 27 News out of Harrisburg. Have you, in your investigation, have you seen any incidents from 2009 when this investigation started to 2011 when Sandusky himself was arrested? There has been reports that he was on Penn State campus with youngsters. Up until that point, he was arrested.
He's frequently observed in the Lash building working out. He's at bowl games with youth. Many of the colleagues observe him showering with boys in the Lash building. Don't report that. Don't think there's anything untoward about that. He's showing up at these camps, by the way, which Penn State supported and contributed to in terms of their operations. He's showing up with young boys, staying in dormitories with them overnight. There's more red flags here than you could count over a long period of time.
Between those 2 years, though, from 2009 to 2011, did you guys see anything?
Between 2009 and 2011, some of the same things I just alluded to. Yes, sir.
Pete Mundine, WGAL in Harrisburg. Joe Paterno, by my count, mentioned more than 100 times. It's only in the first third of the document. Can you, by any chance, classify who was most involved, and if so, was it Joe Paterno for not reporting those incidents?
The reasonable conclusion that we make is that all four individuals that I've mentioned, including Mr. Paterno, made a decision to actively conceal the knowledge and the events of February 2011. I can't parse between them degrees of responsibility. What's significant and shocking is that the four of them, the most powerful people in Penn State University, made a decision to conceal this information.
Judge Freeh, Rosemary Connors with NBC 10 News in Philadelphia. In your report, you make reference to personal notes that Schultz wrote regarding the 1998 investigation, in which he said, "Is this the opening of Pandora's box? Are other children involved?" Do you believe at that point that Schultz and the other authorities knew that they had a child molestation case on their hands?
Well, you know, I can't get into Mr. Schultz's thought process. The document you cite is an extremely relevant document. He asks two questions. Is this a Pandora's box? Are there other children? We also know that at that period, you know, there's a consultation with people outside the university about the implications of this. So they're clearly focused on this, and to ask the question, does this open a Pandora's box, question mark, other children, question mark, is a very strong inference that they were focused not just on what the report was, but the implication as to other victims.
What is your best explanation as to why four senior officials at Penn State chose to actively conceal this information and disregard their obligations to the children?
Well, as we put in our report, the motivation to avoid the consequences of bad publicity. Not just publicity. What are the consequences of bad publicity? The consequences of bad publicity are government investigations, right? Donors being upset, the university community being very upset, as we saw in November of 2011, raising questions about what they themselves did in 1998. What's striking about 1998 is nobody even spoke to Sandusky. Not one of those four persons, including the coach, who was a few steps away from his office. There's no indication anybody spoke to him. There's no indication that Coach Paterno called all of his assistant coaches in and said, hey, look, make sure this guy Sandusky doesn't bring any more kids into the shower room. In other words, there's lots of consequences that go with bad publicity in 2001.
Protect the football program.
I think that's an inference that you can draw, but I think bad publicity affects a panorama of different events, including the brand of Penn State, including the university, including the reputation of coaches, including the ability to do fundraising. It's got huge implications, and I think you could probably name more of them than I can.
John Martin from the Philadelphia Inquirer. Following up on that, were there other incidents or other occasions that you discovered that you would suggest shows a pattern of trying to avoid that publicity?
Well, we know when Mr. Curley speaks to the Second Mile, he uses the same word, that they were worried about Sandusky showering with a boy because of bad publicity. So this notion of bad publicity, which is really disclosure, opening, and reporting, is a pervasive concern and fear by the people running the university.
ABC Philadelphia, you say, Paterno testified to the grand jury that he didn't recall anything with the 1998 incident. Can you elaborate on what you found he knew about that, and in your opinion, do you believe Joe Paterno perjured himself?
Well, I'm not going to comment on whether he perjured himself or not. What I will say is, as you'll see in our report, there's several emails, contemporaneous emails in 1998, which we found, by the way, which show that he's clearly following the case. He's clearly following the 1998 investigation. The coach wants to be advised. What's going on? So the notion that, there was no attention paid at the time is completely contradicted by the evidence.
You talk about, you talk about culture a little bit, and I'm wondering, you're from outside this area, do you believe that the AG's office might have been blinded by that culture, Paterno, Penn State, only because your findings are very different in relating to Joe Paterno than theirs were? 7 months ago, they said he did the right thing.
Well, the Attorney General has a different standard with respect to deciding whether to charge or whether not to charge. We don't have a reasonable doubt standard. Our conclusion, as I stated it, was a reasonable conclusion based on the facts and circumstances. I can't comment on what the Attorney General analyzed or concluded in that regard. I just don't know.
Ben Simino from CBS 3 here in Philadelphia. Given that the vast majority of the trustees who were on the board last year and in years prior who did not provide proper oversight, as you point out, are still on the board today, should they resign?
Well, I can't comment about what my client should do, but I think that's a question you should direct to the board.
Judge, over here. Yes, sir. Stu Bykowski, Philadelphia Daily News. We've been talking about culture here. In your report, a number of individuals were named. Do you have the sense that the football culture at Penn State was an unnamed conspirator?
Well, I don't know what an unnamed conspirator is. What I will say, and what I found to be extremely telling and critical in deciding not just what I thought recommendations should be, is the janitors. I mean, just think a moment for the janitors. The janitors, that's the tone on the bottom, okay? These are the employees of Penn State who clean and maintain the locker rooms in Lashed Building where young boys are being raped. They witness what I think in the report is probably the most horrific rape that's described. And what do? They panic. The janitor who observes it said it's the worst thing he ever saw. He's a Korean War veteran. He said, I've never seen anything like that. It makes me sick. He spoke to the other janitors. They were alarmed and shocked by it. But what did they do? They said, we can't report this because we'll get fired. They knew who Sandusky was. One of the janitors, watched him growing up as a famous defense coordinator coach. They were afraid to take on the football program. They said the university would circle around it. It was like going against the President of the United States. If that's the culture on the bottom, God help the culture at the top, which is what we commented about.
Judge Freeh, where that's concerned, Dan Levy from IQ 169 Philadelphia, have you been in touch, or do you expect to be in touch with either the NCAA or the Big Ten regarding the culture of Penn State football, and if there needs to be action going forward?
We've been in regular contact with both organizations since the investigation began. We haven't obviously given them or supplied them any of the evidence or contents that we have found, but we have been in regular discussions with them at their initiation. They are conducting, as they've said publicly, inquiries into this matter. What they find is going to be based on, you know, their criteria and their conclusions.
Yes, sir.
Sandusky comes to the university in '68, and I don't notice in your report anything. Did your investigation go back into the 80s and 70s to look and see how long this process had gone beyond the last 14 years you looked into, sir?
Yes, it did.
What did you find?
Yes, sir.
What did you find?
How many children were molested after the '98 incident? Half?
You know, I can't make an estimate on that. We asked the state police if they could do that. It's very uncertain. I can't make an estimate on that. I'm sorry.
Barbara Barr, WGAL. You said that the board mishandled Joe Paterno's firing, but was it justified?
Yes.
John Meyer, WNP in Scranton. There's already Penn State fans online that are saying that you're just going after a dead man who can't defend himself in Joe Paterno. What's your response to them saying that?
Well, we have a great deal of respect for Mr. Paterno, and condolences for his family on the loss. It's a person with a terrific legacy, a great legacy, who brought huge value to not just the university but the program. He, as someone once said, you know, made perhaps the worst mistake of his life. But we're not singling him out. We're putting him in a category of 4 other people who we would say are the major leaders of Penn State. But he also was a major leader of Penn State. The facts are the facts. The emails, the notes that Schultz took from meetings in February of 2001, there's a whole bunch of evidence here. And we're saying the reasonable conclusion from that evidence is he was an integral part of this active decision to conceal. I regret that based on the damage it does, obviously, to his legacy because he is no longer here. I wish we had had the opportunity to speak to him. I wish we had had the ability to show him those emails. We found those emails, as you know, after he was deceased. But what my report says is what the evidence and what the facts show, and we've laid that out as fairly and clearly as we can.
Rosemary Connors again with NBC.
Sorry, you just asked a question.
Mike Sisek from the Scranton Times-Tribune. The evidence is overwhelming, but there are people close to Paterno who say they were interviewed, they felt there was an agenda, they felt that there may have been some leading questions or some attempts to get them to say things that weren't true. What's your response to that?
It's not correct.
Judge, the confidential notes that Schultz had, the deep staff confidential notes that were removed by his assistant from his office, the grand jury didn't have those. How did you come by those? How difficult were those to obtain that were so significant to your findings?
Well, it was a question of skill and luck. I don't discount either. He actively sought to conceal those records. We found them in conjunction with the Attorney General. They're very critical notes, very critical records. They go to the conclusion that this gentleman just asked me about. You know, it was an active case of trying to conceal evidence. You know, you don't do that. It's a dumb thing to do. But the result is we did get them, and it's very significant evidence.
Judge Freeh, Jack Maggie from the Associated Press. I'm wondering what Chief Harmon, Karen Arnold, and Mike McQueary may have been able to add and been able to speak with them. And who are the other folks you were asked not to interview?
Well, I mean, there were a number of individuals. Those two, of course. We were asked not to interview the janitors until the trial was over. We immediately interviewed them once the trial was over. And as I said, I think the evidence they provided was some of the most significant evidence in the case in terms of understanding the culture, you know, what went on there. There were a number of other individuals, I don't care to list them, that the Attorney General asked us not to speak to. We tried to speak to Sandusky. He did not want to speak to us. There were a number of people we would like to speak to. The Assistant District Attorney who declined the prosecution in 1998, she didn't want to speak to us. So there's a lot of folks in that category.
Judge Freeh.
You just asked one.
Judge
Yes,
Freeh,
sir.
Dan Kelly from the Daily. Could you elaborate on what your investigation found with regard to Mr. Sandusky in the 70s and the 80s and the period preceding 1998?
We didn't find any significant evidence in the 70s and 80s.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Freeh, Andy Walsh, Next Star Broadcasting, WWTV in Pennsylvania. Was Joe Paterno powerful enough to stop this culture of concealment? Could he have stopped it if he tried, do you believe? Or would he have been squashed by Schultz and Curley and the rest of that gang?
Many witnesses we spoke to described Mr. Paterno as one of the most powerful leaders on the campus. He ran his football building. He clearly ran the Lash building. I think it's a very strong and reasonable inference that he could have done so if he wished.
Judge Freeh.
Okay, you get your second
All right,
question.
okay. Rosemary Connors again with NBC 10 in Philadelphia. In your report, you talk about Penn State's general counsel becoming aware and getting involved in 2010, 2011, but outside counsel had been consulted in 2001 and earlier. In the report, you say that general counsel was told by outside counsel that Children and Youth Services had been contacted. Can you elaborate more on it, as it sort of suggests that there was even internal conspiracy and cover-up to these different councils?
I think my answer to that would be, if you look at the evidence in our report, the general counsel for the university and outside counsel were seriously deficient in providing good and important and accurate counsel to their clients.
Judge Freeh? We didn't ask, did you ask one before?
No.
Okay, Your Honor.
I just wanted to ask you, do you, outside of the 4 senior managers that you cite in this report, are there other people within Old Main or the board that you specifically believe played a significant part in helping to conceal these incidents?
No.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned publicity. There are parents out there right now who are looking at Penn State, maybe considering it for their youngster in terms of attending the school. You've looked at all of this that's happened there over the last decade plus. What is your sense of the job that Penn State has done safeguarding the welfare of kids in general? Based on what you found in this particular incident, what should parents think about sending their children to Penn State and whether those kids will be properly safeguarded?
You know, look, I'm a parent of 6 boys. I think parents should feel comfortable and assured at this point that sending their children there, they'll be as safe as they will be at any other good university. I mean, the board and Old Main, to its credit, has made immense and significant changes since November of 2011. In fact, I haven't even read it, but apparently they issued a new guideline even yesterday with respect to children being allowed in certain facilities unsupervised. You know, they have good personnel files and policies, AD 39, HR 99, a couple of revisions that they've recently made. They've taken the Clery Act seriously for the first time. It's being implemented. They've hired the right people. They're doing training. They're doing awareness. They're spending millions of dollars to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So as a parent talking to other parents, I think they can be very comfortable.
Judge Freeh, Wendy Silverwood, Penn State for Responsible Stewardship. I'm an alumni, and my parents are alumni, and I'm still outraged about the negligence on the second mile. When are we going to find out about Lynn Abraham's findings? I'm beside myself about what they knew, when did they know, and why didn't they act? This was a children's charity.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I think you got to direct your question there. We did as much as we could in that regard. Relevant to our mandate, many of the people there would not speak to us. We didn't get access to their records. We don't have subpoena power, as you know, but you raise a good question.
Thank you, ladies
Thank you
and
very
gentlemen.
much.